Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. So my name is Dave Horton. I work for a company called OneTrust, and what we do, we actually provide a software platform that helps companies with global data protection, planning, and also implementation. So really what I'm going to tackle today is how we transition GDPR from a task that was very much kind of a burden on a business into something that is now a business as usual activity, and what can we derive in terms of benefits to the business as well. So just to give you a few insights, and I'm sure everyone in the room is very well aware of the impacts of the GDPR, but essentially it was a global privacy catalyst. Although we had very strong data protection rules in certainly Germany and some other jurisdictions as well, the GDPR really made companies kind of wake up to the idea that they were very accountable for the data that they held. They were also kind of interacting with customers in a way that had to be reviewed to see, well, what is that data, or how are they going to trust what we can do with this data moving forwards? And it really did spark in the industry kind of a spring of other privacy laws that came along. So we're seeing at the moment a global privacy trade war going on. Essentially, each country now wants to have a standard of data protection that would be equivalent or exceeding the GDPR. And this is not just on the privacy management side. We're seeing this also from a security aspect as well. You know, it's now part of the DNA of many security programs. So if you're looking at the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, for example, you know, and if California was a country, it would be the 10th largest economy in the world. So they've actually defined a new privacy law that would be specific to the Californians operating that area. So it really has sparked a lot of kind of interest in, you know, how can we make the consumer, the data subject, primary when it comes to handling their data. And compliance is not just about meeting the law. It's also about the accountability to your data subjects. What we're seeing is that companies are now seeing data protection standards and having a high standard as a differentiator for their company against their competitors. If I give someone a better experience in terms of control around their personal data, it gives me a much better reputation in my market. So this is something that we're really seeing is kind of not just compliance being about meeting the law, but it's also about being accountable to all of our data subjects who ultimately could be even funding our business. So what does the solution look like? And we're going to run through 10 steps, but essentially this whole privacy program piece, making it business as usual, is really something that is a life cycle. So firstly, we need to check for and implement the standards, the regulatory compliance that we need to meet. Which countries do I operate in? What are my jurisdictions that I need to meet? We need to then review and update our organizational measures, make sure that our security is in line with the standards that we hold as a company. Test and audit, improving that communication, which includes training our staff around how do we interact with our data subjects, what rights do we want to give people. And then ultimately we need to be able to review, revise, repeat this process so it's constantly evolving and improving over time, especially when there are new derogations, there are new updates from the supervisory authorities, when we're looking at EDPB guidances as well. You know, we need to bake that into our life cycle. So let's have a look at 10 steps for ongoing GDPR compliance. So I'm going to run through these 10, but essentially, you know, the first one that I'm going to cover is maybe more for organizations that are starting out in this journey, or certainly ones that are growing as a company. So when we start to look at our maturity, this is really a key aspect to just understand what countries, what laws do I need to adhere to? How do I compare to others in my industry and in my country? And this maturity in planning will allow you just to understand, well, what point or percentage are we right now? And then you can really work with your business to define, well, what is the roadmap for our privacy program? How do we want this to go forwards? What standard do we want to adhere to? If we know where we are right now and we know where we aspire to, it's going to be a much easier process to just understand, well, what do we need to do in order to get there? So it's a very important first step is just to understand what this looks like. Now, one of the interesting aspects where I've been consulting with clients, and to give you some context, I've been working for OneTrust for around about 3 years. Pre-GDPR, obviously, people were very much kind of panicked about how it was going to affect the industry that they were working in. And one of the hidden benefits of the GDPR was actually how companies can actually understand where their data is located and where they've actually got duplication of data. This is really where a business as usual activity can be, well, if we've got 10 locations of the same data, then we can reduce that footprint and it's cheaper for us to store in the first instance. If I'm looking at this from an information security standpoint, I've got a smaller attack surface that I need to protect as a company. So there was aspects around the data mapping, the Article 30 process, the Article 32 process, where we could actually derive some benefit to the business in terms of cost savings, in terms of higher security standards. We're also able to kind of consider techniques like de-identification and anonymization of that data. Obviously, we always have to be very cognizant of the fact that there are advanced data analytics and AI technologies available that could potentially re-merge data, but it certainly allows us to understand, firstly, where this data is so that we can understand if that would be a good method or not. Now, when we look at automating the data protection impact assessments, this is in a funny order for some reason, but essentially what we're able to do is really just understand as a step-by-step process, do I need an assessment in the first place? By reviewing the guidelines that have been set out, by following a risk-based approach to understand, well, is there an impact or a high risk of any particular activity that we're taking part in? It just allows us to essentially understand, well, do we need a data protection impact assessment at all? If we don't, then we should still document that decision, but have some way that we can reference this later on. So this is really important from an accountability standpoint around any decision-making process, around a new process that we've had. But the derived benefit to the business is really that we've got a high standard of understanding about the impact of a particular activity before we go live. If we look at vendor risk management, this is an area that has seen a lot of improvement in the last few years and months, really. Essentially, vendor risk management has always existed in other departments. So if we're looking at, say, information security, typically if I'm evaluating an asset, I'm evaluating that vendor, then I'm running my own security reviews. Procurement might have a data cache of all the contracts that we hold with those vendors. Each department might actually look at a vendor in a very different aspect, but each one is using their own method, their own Excel spreadsheet to manage and track their vendors. And what we're looking at now is that if we're looking at all of these different departments and we're having to become accountable for all of our vendors, then this becomes a very difficult thing for us to manage moving forwards. So when we start looking at, better solutions, essentially centrally managing into a software platform is a logical step. Each department can have their own entry point into that platform. It removes the aspect of having to integrate all of these different assets and the data sets into a uniform platform. But essentially, what this allows you to do is become very accountable for your processes to the same standards that you hold yourself. So this is something where we're looking at how do we modernize a vendor management platform so that we can reduce the Excel hell that we see today. The data subject request process. Now, a lot of people see this as a very burdensome issue when it comes to to handling our data subjects, especially if our business is derived mainly through the interaction that we have with our customers. The GDPR opened up extra obligations under the controller's aspect to actually intake those requests, handle those appropriately, send data to respond to right of access and portability. It was a very complex problem for a lot of organizations. But again, this is something that we are able to operationalize, to give our data subjects a very decent experience when it comes to interacting with your company. So there are technology benefits that we've derived and helped with certain clients of ours. So such as being able to create an intake form that would then go into a central queue that we could then triage and validate those requests. We can then route those requests to the correct teams and departments. We can actually operationalize by connecting with APIs and technologies like CRMs. So rather than there having to be a human interacting with every single aspect of that data subject access request, you can have API calls into your Salesforce, your BMC Remedy, your ServiceNow systems to actually retrieve that information automatically so that it is less costly to you as a business. So we're really seeing some maturity from our clients around making this a very cheap process and transactional process. Next up is how we send this information back to the data subject. There's been some really interesting articles about people that have tested companies' data subject access request process and actually used it as a kind of a simulated phishing attack, essentially, to see what information they can derive out of a company that has a DSAR process. But essentially, what we're able to do is enable a data subject-specific portal with any kind of consumer identity platform that you might have to actually give them access to their own portal within your website where they can actually access their data. And essentially securing any kind of feedback that you send to them through an encrypted portal. Now, ultimately, the data subject access request process is all about accountability, being able to show the regulator that you have a process in place that allows you to intake those data subject requests. Is very important to have metrics and reporting on. More so that you can just demonstrate that to the business, this is how many requests we're getting in, this is how long it's taking us to handle. If we've got 30 days to respond to those requests without extension, then how are we hitting that KPI? What does that look like? So essentially, having a process in place is going to benefit the business when it comes to a data subject experience. Cookie consent on our mobile applications. This is an area where you're constantly fighting with different departments within your organization. I've spoken to many organizations with, that make a lot of money through their website, for example. Marketers are probably the worst people to speak to about GDPR right now, because every decision that you make around the compliance program and how we interact with third-party tracking cookies on our website can affect the business directly. So there is a balancing point that we're seeing with a lot of organizations around how do we manage cookie consent. But essentially, the solutions that we're seeing is that essentially you can scan your website, you can get insight as to who are the third parties that we're inadvertently or advertently sending this data to. We can categorize those cookies based on the privacy directive and give the data subject a lot of exposure to the reasons, the purposes that you are using these third parties. Essentially, again, giving the data subject a better experience and more information around what it is that they need to know about how you're using their data. And it's very important for us to enable an ongoing monitoring process. Larger organizations that I work with typically have 5, 10 content providers on their website, people that are independently coding and uploading content to their website. It's very difficult for me from a compliance standpoint to have the same standard across 10 people. But if I'm scanning my website on a regular basis to understand what's new, what kind of like buttons have we got on our new page that might be tracking, we can get some insights around who are we sharing third-party data with that we now need to consider. So that's an important step, and really this kind of links to a lot of the guidance that we're seeing as well. So if we're looking at the CNIL or the ICO in the UK, there are certain aspects now where a cookie solution is very much required, and certain cookie walls that were previously in place are something that should be reconsidered, and also our retention period for the data that we're storing in cookies should also be considered. So there are many different aspects that, as business as usual, that we need to feed in. But as I'll mention later on, it is a situation where we actually have to involve multiple departments. It's not just the privacy team or compliance team aspect. It's something that we need to get involved in across the organization. Our incident and breach response, this is a very complex problem right now for a lot of organizations. If I'm a multinational organization, if I'm working in the United States, for example, each state has their own incident and breach policies, for example, the people that you have to contact in case of an incident when you're reporting to an authority. But essentially, having a process in place where when that request, that incident comes into you, you have a timer that is set right then and there that gives you an indication as to when do I need to inform the relevant authorities. So having a centralized intake form, being able to integrate that process into your existing processes that might be in place with with your IT teams, IT security teams as an example, again, all feeds into this records and metrics where you can actually see at any point in time what were the incidents that were brought to our attention and at what time. Very important to have that process re-looked at when we're considering, say, Article 33 and Article 34. One of the biggest aspects that a lot of companies struggled with was kind of looking at the legal basis. What legal basis are you processing that data for that data subject? And essentially revisiting this on a regular basis, making sure that this is still appropriate is something that a lot of organizations need to build into that review process. So when we are looking at improvements, we revisit each of our processing activities and we just understand, is this still the most appropriate legal basis for us to be using? Certainly when we start hearing about updates to e-privacy regulation as an example, this might obviously completely go out the window, but essentially you want to have some process in place where you can review that regularly. Now, I mentioned the training aspect very briefly, but education of our teams is almost as important as actually implementing that process altogether. Essentially, if I have a great DSAR process for our data subjects to make use of their rights, I need to educate my customer services team. I need to educate my front desk staff, for example, around how to respond and what the time pressure is when it comes to a DSAR request. Similar for an incident, as soon as an incident has been made aware of, if you're looking at specific language in the GDPR, then, again, what are those time limits? We really need to have a process in place where training is baked in. It's also reviewed when I'm onboarding staff. This is also baked in our standards into this process. So I mentioned it briefly, but think beyond the privacy team. The privacy team is obviously, they have oversight. Essentially, we do need to engage with many other areas of the business. So when we're looking at, say, our marketing operations, if we do have an incident, for example, our marketing people are going to be in a much better position to give us good advice about how do we act on Article 34, where we might actually have to get in contact with data subjects to inform them of an incident. When we're looking at our our vendor and procurement teams, they have to feed into our Article 28 ambitions and our information security review process. So again, they need to be involved. Our customer success team, where they're actually trying to help companies make the most of the customer experience, we need to be speaking to these people about what is acceptable and unacceptable when it comes to those data subject rights. So essentially, when we're looking at the kind of end goal, essentially, goal one is to have our privacy compliance program kind of checkbox and make sure that our regulator is happy with what we're doing with the data if quizzed about it. But essentially, our business champions also need to feed into our program. They need to be able to give us advice and sign off on some of the decisions that we're going to make. But we also can then leverage some of that business differentiation. So I mentioned before, having a good data subject experience, it's becoming more and more important to people as they become more aware around their rights and the privacy standards of other companies. So being able to document and kind of approach that competitive aspect is going to be really, really important. But what we're seeing right now is that the business value and the value around the ethics that we hold, this is something that is being written into the DNA of a lot of companies. People are actually leading first with privacy as a standard. So this is really important for us to bake in to our programs. So I'm going to leave you with some final tips. There are lots of things still to come, with the GDPR and other privacy programs. But codes of conduct, standards around how companies should be setting up their privacy programs, certifications like ISO 27700, for example, standards around security with privacy. Cross-border transfers, I'm from the UK, but you can imagine the Brexit nightmare is going to be a similar issue of something to keep your eye on in the future. There's new technologies that weren't specifically called out in the GDPR, like blockchain and AI, that we need to also be aware of, see how developments occur with those. So a couple of things to leave you with. As I mentioned, the company I represent, OneTrust, we have a software platform that helps you with a lot of these steps, whether it's with your privacy program, your internally facing kind of aspects, whether it's around your externally facing aspects and your cookies, your data subject rights, your consent and preferences. We have a vendor risk management module that allows you to have all your different departments essentially get the derived benefit from having a centralized system. We also have a solution for managing incident and breach and actually looking into those laws that we need to adhere to using a database that is being held by Data Guidance, which is one of the acquisitions that OneTrust has made this year. So it's really kind of a powerful piece of software. If you are interested in seeing a demonstration, we are downstairs. We also have the green GDPR books. We're becoming quite famous for these. I'd imagine some people have already received one of these, but we've got them in German and in English. If you're interested, you can pick up a free copy downstairs. So with that, last thing I'll mention, we do have our own privacy events that are free of charge, that if you're an IPP member, you can also get CPE credits for, and they're in a number of German cities this year with German speaking, so it won't be me, unfortunately, but essentially you can attend those events if you're interested, network with people in similar industries to yourselves. We have a website where you can sign up. I think I'm over time, so questions might be ambitious, but thank you very much for your time. If you do have any questions, I am downstairs for the rest of the day as well as my team. Be more than happy to help.